To understand objects, we need to understand classes, because objects are just instantiations of a class. They bring the class into the real world. And so let's create an NPC. An NPC. Now, classes are just high-level abstractions of more specific types of things. So think of a cat. A cat is a feline. Now think of a dog. A dog is a canine. Now both felines and canines are, well, they're animals, right? And so an animal, a generic, an abstract, gives way or birth to a feline, which can get specific into a cat. Same way the animal can give birth to a canine, which can get specific into a dog. And so our generic, our abstract NPC, we can make specific into something like a guard or a soldier. And so to create a class in JavaScript, we literally use the word class followed by the name of the class. So our class is going to be called NPC. And then we followed it with a constructor. Constructor gets run when we instantiate or create an object of the type NPC. So think of it like when you were born, a constructor was run. It gave you a first name, a last name, a date of birth, hospital you were born at, your parents. And so when our NPC gets born, they are going to get a first name, a last name, an occupation, a power level, and a city. Now we need to save these values somewhere. If we didn't save them, they just get lost. We have to make these values part of the properties of the object. And that's what these lines of code are for. F name, L name, occupation, level, and city. We use the keyword this to bind these variables and these values to the object. The keyword this is a bit complicated. It can be confusing. It refers to the current context of the program. In this case, this refers to the current object being created. If we had multiple objects, each object would have their own version of this. And so with our constructor, we're just saving the values as properties of the specific type of object that's being created in the present. Now our NPC can also do things, perform actions, verbs. We define those with functions. And so our NPC is going to have the ability to tell us who they are, their level, and their job. And so just like that, we've created an abstract class called NPC that's going to have a first name, last name, occupation, level, city, and they're going to be able to do things like tell us who they are, their level, and their job. To instantiate or bring this class into the real world, we have to create an object of type NPC. So we do that like this. I'm just going to create a variable called NPC1. We use the keyword new, which tells JavaScript that we want to call the constructor of our class. We'll say first name Rex, last name Tungsten. We'll say occupation of guard, level 22, and a city of New York City. And so just like that, we've created a new object referenced by NPC1 of type NPC, first name Rex, last name Tungsten, occupation guard, level 22 in New York City. Now to tell the NPC to do something, we call its functions. When we call a function from an object, we call its methods. So we refer to a method or a function as a method. And so to call the method of the object, we use object notation, which is just the name of the variable followed by period, and then the method name. So who am I? And just like that, our NPC told us who he was. Now we can also access the properties. And so if these are functions or methods, these are functions or methods right here. These guys are properties. We can access the properties of our object in the exact same way, object notation. So NPC1 dot first name, and we get the value of Rex. Now what we just did is non-kosher. This is not how you should be programming. This brings us to the idea of encapsulation. And what is encapsulation in object-oriented programming? And that's what we just did. We created a class and created objects from that class. Object-oriented programming, encapsulation. What is encapsulation? Encapsulation is basically the idea that anything in your class should be hidden from the user unless you need the user to see it. And so think of it like Apple and their iPhones and their software. They only let you know what they want you to know about their software, about how their hardware works. It's all proprietary. And so encapsulation is hiding everything from the user and only letting them interact with the object the exact way you want them to interact with the object. Why do we need to do this? Well, as you can see with the f name, we could access the specific property of this object. That means we can define or redefine the property of the object. What if we said this? What if we redefined the name from a string to a number? Any code here that relied or expected f name to be a string, but now it's getting a number, the code would break. So this is an easy way to hack a piece of code or to break a piece of code. It's to allow the user to fumble around with the intimate properties of your class. And so we use encapsulation to put a shell around these properties. Now, how do we do that in JavaScript? We do that with a method called closures. Now, this is a pretty high-level method or high-level idea. If you're just getting into JavaScript, it's going to be very confusing, but I'll try my best. And so a closure is basically a function that returns a function or a function that returns an object. And so what we're going to do is that instead of creating our NPC objects with a class, we're going to create an NPC object with a function. And so we're not going to call a constructor. We're going to call a function to create the class. And so that code looks like this. Now, why are we using a function to create the NPC when we could just create an NPC with a class? Well, when we define a function, we're defining a specific scope or context. And so these variables here, they're able to be seen by this function and any other scope tracking inwards from the function. Any scope outside of this function has no idea that these variables exist. And so we use this ability for functions to create their own scope in order to encapsulate an object. And so we have basically the exact same code. We're saving the values as variables of the function now, and we're returning an object. When we returned or created a class right here, this constructor returned an object. So it's no different. We're still returning an object of type quote unquote NPC. So let's see what that looks like. So let's create an NPC 2. And this time, instead of calling the constructor of our class, we're just going to create an NPC with this function. So create NPC, we'll call her Lala. She is a soldier. Her level, say 25, and city of Baltimore. And just like that, we've created another NPC, but instead of using the class, which doesn't encapsulate properly, we use a function which has the ability to encapsulate. So we can interact with it the exact same way. And so using object notation, we can tell Lala to tell us who she is. Who am I? And just like that, my name is Lala. Now let's do what we did with the first instance of our NPC, which is try and access the private variables or private properties of the object. So let's see if we can get to her first name. npc2.f name is equal to undefined. And so just like that, because we use a function to create an object, and a function has this ability to create its own scope, we've essentially encapsulated our quote-unquote class. We're not using the keyword class, but for all intents and purposes, this thing acts like a class. Now I'm going to stop it here because that's a lot to go over. This should have been maybe 2 videos because you don't normally introduce classes and objects with closures like this. And so what did we go over? Well, we understood that a class was a high-level abstraction, something generic. And that when we bring that generic thing into the world, we can specify and specify and specify. And so by creating a class in JavaScript, an NPC class, we could specify that the NPC becomes something like a guard or a soldier. We saw that classes have constructors, which are like functions that get run when they're born, which instantiate or solidify properties of that object. We saw that a class can also have actions or verbs in terms of or in the form of functions, these guys here. And that when we call these actions and call the properties, we use object notation, which is just this guy here. The variable name followed by a period, followed by either the property or the method. And then we also saw, which again, if you don't understand it, trust me, it's a thing to wrap your head around, that we can encapsulate a class, quote unquote class, by using a function that returns an object or another function. In this case, our function returned an object. And we use this kind of roundabout way of creating a quote unquote class because a function has the ability to create its own scope. and anything outside of that scope can't see into the function. So I hope this wasn't too confusing. I just needed to make this video because in my other videos we were talking about object notation, calling methods, interacting with objects. If you find any value in this, if it made sense, like, comment, share, subscribe, thumbs up, whichever platform you're watching this on, and I'll see you guys in a different video.